This is Dialogue Conspiracy, a public affairs presentation of KLRB News.
Talk about conspiracy. Should we talk about the conspiracy against the FBI? There's a charge
leveled by, well, it's reported by the Associated Press last Wednesday, 31st of May. A federal grand jury has been ordered to investigate an informer's charges that the FBI and the U.S. Attorney in Seattle were involved in illegal conspiracies to obstruct justice. The story reported by the Associated Press, as we said. This U.S. District Court order was based on charges brought yesterday by David Sands, I guess is the way it's pronounced, S-A-N-N-E-S, charges against Stan Pitkin, U.S. Attorney for Western Washington, and the FBI. Sands alleges that the FBI conspired in a bombing plan, in a felony, and in obstruction of justice, and that Pitkin has conspired to conceal such activities on the part of the FBI. Sands pleaded guilty of improper disposing of rubbish. He dumped 3 pounds of cow manure in the first-floor lobby of the U.S. courthouse on April 5th as a war protest, and he tried to include in his opening remarks alleged confessions of 5 persons admitting to conspiring to obstruct justice. When the judge in the case, Judge William T. Beeks, ordered him to stick to the issues, Sands said he had been trying for about a year to bring into court his charges. The FBI instructed him as an informer to allow a bombing to take place and to, quote, make sure that the man who set the bomb died in a booby-trapped explosion, unquote. The judge in the case then ordered the government to take Sands before a federal grand jury, which is where he's going now.
Well, what he did, he's been trying for a year to say that the federal government, the FBI, hire agents to bomb buildings, and then they kill the person that they've hired to do it. This was a charge that Louis Tackwood made about Los Angeles at the San Diego Convention for Squad 19, the criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department, was to hire radicals and young people to bomb buildings and kill people at the San Diego Convention as an excuse to round up the radicals in a manner identical to the way Hitler did when he gained power in Germany. And then they were to kill the people they hired. So this young informer up in Seattle said that he is charging the government with conspiracy. This is where it should be. I hope we'll talk about this during the show, how the Justice Department is guilty of conspiracy and planning conspiracies at every level, and of violence and of killing. And the only way that this man could be heard was to take pounds of cow manure and put them into the federal building in the court and dump them there. And he put a lot of manure around the lobby of the court. Then he was arrested for putting the manure, and then in defending himself, he could bring out the reason he was doing it so that it's on the records. There was no way to get to court to get the federal government to answer the charges about wanting to murder the young radicals or bombing the building, so he just spread the manure around. And now his defense is that the way he did this was to get attention. But there should be suits coming out this year continuously on against the federal government as being the conspirators. We're talking about political assassinations and conspiracies, and my charge is that the federal government are the conspirators. In the paper this week, Phil, there was an article from new acting chief of the FBI, Patrick Gray III. The title reads, "No Way to Detect Probable Political Assassinations." This came out in the San Jose Mercury on Friday this week. And I had just completed the day before an article for the Conspiracy newsletter I'm writing on how the federal government is going to clean itself of all responsibility when Richard Nixon is going to be killed.
This article would be a week ago, Friday.
No, it was just this week. This is Saturday. It was this week that this article came out. And I was writing, before this came out, the way the FBI and the Secret Service were clearing the way of any responsibility for further political assassinations. What Patrick Gray said is that gun control is an area that you never get guaranteed, which is true. Then he said you have to reach the hearts and minds of people. And how do you reach the heart and mind of an individual who apparently is so completely withdrawn from our society that he doesn't want to react as any of us do? End quotes. Well, I think that the assassins are reacting in exactly the way that Patrick Gray III reacts. And I have, on a couple of other shows, mentioned his part in calling U.S. Attorney Robert Meyer in Los Angeles and firing him because Meyer was investigating the murders of Ruben Salazar by the Los Angeles Police Department and Jerry Leon May, a black veteran who is home from Vietnam who was shot by the Los Angeles Police Department. Patrick Gray stops the investigation of the actual assassination squads in Los Angeles. I don't know how many he stopped, but I can name several cases that I know of that were political assassinations, and he interfered with the investigation. So the murderers are still out at large. They're on the streets to do their other crimes because they were never investigated and they're protected. So when he says that murderers don't react as any of us do, they react exactly as he does, and he protects them. People want to know what they can do after they listen to these shows. You could begin writing to members of the Senate and asking that Patrick Gray III be removed as the head of the FBI. You see, he wasn't named acting head. He's acting from the Justice Department, and he's now director of the FBI because in order to be the head of the FBI, he'd have to have Senate approval. But by having a salary from the Justice Department and working from that office, nobody has to investigate the background of Patrick Gray III. Now, the FBI was under criticism, he claimed, for not being able to find people like Lee Harvey Oswald, Sirhan, James Earl Ray. They were never listed in the FBI files. Well, of course they weren't listed. They were agents of the FBI. Why would they? They were assassins hired and protected by the FBI while they went around their various jobs and then framed by the Justice Department that they could never have trials. Lee Harvey Oswald was killed. Sirhan never had a fair trial, and James Ray can't have a trial at all. So how would you find these people as being the alleged assassins? They didn't kill the men that they are claimed to have killed. The name Justice Department is so confused, Phil. It's so turned around. It's the Department of Injustice, like 1984. The word is wrong. They are planning these assassinations and hiding the conspirators, and then claiming that you can't find these completely withdrawn people. They have a path to take before the gun goes off, and they are losing their traces. We've talked about this before. And they're not withdrawn. They're purposely losing their traces. The first half of the show today, I want to talk about Jim Garrison and what's happening in New Orleans. And the second half, we'll talk about the Wallace shooting and the more evidence on Bramer, that it was a conspiracy. But I want to give a little background on Jim Garrison. He was the gentleman who said that there was a conspiracy that killed John Kennedy, and that one of the people involved in the conspiracy was Clay Shaw, who lives in New Orleans, and Jim Garrison is the district attorney of New Orleans. And the trial was very difficult to conduct down there to convict Clay Shaw of conspiracy because David Ferry was killed and Guy Bannister was killed, and the main people that Garrison wanted for that trial were all sent out of town. Gordon Novell went to Ohio, and the governor wouldn't extradite him, and Bradley came to California, and Reagan wouldn't extradite him, and Sergio Acacia Smith went to Texas, and Comley wouldn't extradite him. Then a few of them were paid off. One was given a chain of motels in New Orleans, another one was given a bathhouse, and some were convicts on narcotic charges that were in jail that couldn't speak up at the trial. They were discredited. So Jim had a hard time running this case, and Clay Shaw was acquitted of any part of the conspiracy. Then Jim had evidence, Jim Garrison had evidence that Clay Shaw lied at the trial. He charged with perjury and said that he did know David Ferry. He knew Lee Harvey Oswald. He had a group of many, many witnesses that saw these men together. But Jim Garrison couldn't have that trial. The federal government stopped in. And I'm reading for the New York Times, July 1971. It said, Mr. Garrison lost an attempt last year to convict Clay Shaw. He then filed perjury charges, but the federal judge ordered him to stop further prosecution of Mr. Shaw. So the federal government stopped Jim Garrison from prosecuting Clay Shaw on a perjury charge. Now, what happened was that John Mitchell, in July 1971, John Mitchell and the Justice Department, through a U.S. attorney, Gerald Galinghouse, in New Orleans, arrested Jim Garrison on a charge of taking bribes for illegal pinball gambling in New Orleans. This is John Mitchell, Attorney General John Mitchell, had Jim Garrison taken off from his home and handcuffed and fingerprinted, and Time Magazine was there, and the Associated Press, the New York Times, and they took pictures and gave a lot of publicity to the fact that Jim Garrison was doing something illegal in New Orleans, and that the Justice Department had investigated him regarding payoffs. And the man who triggered Jim Garrison as doing the payoffs, his name is Pershing Gervais. He was a private detective that worked for Jim Garrison in the New Orleans area. He worked for him from 1962 to 1965. He was his close friend. And this man delivered money to Jim Garrison's home. And then the money was marked, and he brought it to Jim. And the money was marked, and Jim Garrison was fingered as accepting this pinball dealer's money. And Mitchell put a federal charge against him that would give him 5 years in prison and a $70,000 fine if he was found guilty. And they named some other law enforcement men in the New Orleans area that were guilty. And the Justice Department said he took up to $1,500 a month in bribes. Jim Garrison said, "I never took $1 in my life." Well, Pershing Gervais took the money to Jim Garrison's home. The federal government came in and took pictures of Garrison, arrested him. This was in July 1971. We're in May of 1972, and some news came out. We mentioned it briefly on our show last week, and then my New Orleans papers came. You take in the area here, if you take the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Jose Mercury, you don't see a thing of the new revealing of evidence of Pershing Gervais. And I'm going to read you what Gervais said, because I have the details on the charges now. And I cross-filed this. This is the way I do my research. The newspaper article that was in the New Orleans State's item of May 25th, 1972, telling about what the Justice Department did to Jim Garrison, makes a lot of charges. And they fit in. If I read this article and explain it with the people listening to this show, you will understand how I do my research and how it fits into the pattern of political assassinations that we talk about so often. Pershing Gervais claimed that the Justice Department forced him to make a false affidavit against Jim Garrison and then arranged a fake job for him in Canada to keep him out of sight. He names 3 people in the Justice Department. The names are Gerald Scher, Reese Cash, and Kathy Kimruth. And they came to him and told him to plant this evidence against Jim Garrison. This was a job that he was to do. Then he was to take his wife and family, children, to Oregon on a little vacation and go to Vancouver in British Columbia. And they gave him a job. His first job in Canada was to spy on a government, on an oil company, and find out why they weren't given certain drilling rights, why the company wasn't given drilling rights. And he backed down. He didn't want to spy on this oil company, and he backed down on doing this to the oil company, and the Justice Department was mad. And they were afraid, I guess, that Gervais would talk, which is what he's finally doing. So they got him in touch with what they call a field traffic manager of General Motors. Now, this is the way the Justice Department hides its traces of being involved in planting people in new occupations after they have framed somebody for them and done their work. They call General Motors in Detroit, and General Motors calls Ottawa, Canada. It talks to the president of General Motors, and a job was arranged for Gervais for $18,000 a year. Now, he didn't do anything at General Motors. The money was payoff for his framing Jim Garrison. So he's on the payroll of General Motors in Canada, and he isn't doing anything. Now, he goes to Washington immediately after he plants his evidence on Garrison, and they change his name to Paul Mason. And this is why it's so hard to trace these assassins. And in my cross-filing system, I have aliases, galore, and all kinds of different names. He had his name changed to Paul Mason by the Justice Department. And then his child was given a new birth certificate because he was ready to start school in Canada.
Now, on a point like that, what might be considered a relatively minor point, how does the Justice Department justify changing a person's name and his daughter's name? Is there a reason given?
Well, yes, the reason, I'll continue through the 2 articles, and the reason is obvious. They have framed Jim Garrison, and they're paying off the person. They're going to give him $18,000
well, yeah,
a year.
That's what you're saying, but I mean, what is the upfront reason that they say they're doing this?
Well, right now
they're not going to say they're doing it because they framed Jim Garrison.
Well, the Canadian Mounted Police have come out, and the contact man who was to arrange the contacts and safety for Gervais in Canada, his name is Mr. Blakemore, and the Canadian Mounted Police said that this particular man left the Mounted Police this week. He's not working anymore. He retired. You see, he retired. Then the commissioner Mr. Higgett in Ottawa, who's the head of the intelligence unit of Royal Canadian Mounted Police, said we don't talk about things like that. Now, if they don't talk about it, certainly our Justice Department, Mr. Patrick Gray and John Mitchell aren't going to talk about it. You asked the question, what does our Justice Department say about it? The interview that Gervais gave was in Canada from a Canadian radio station. Our Associated Press, United Press, the people in this country don't even know this is happening except in the New Orleans State's item, Jim Garrison's local paper. But it didn't even make the front pages there. When Jim was arrested, it makes the front pages. When it finds out that the Justice Department framed him, it makes the 3rd or 5th page of his local paper. But why would the Justice Department explain what they're doing when they keep from you what they're doing?
So there hasn't been an explanation.
Until you ask them, until people, we talk about in Carmel, but this is a small town and we reach a small geographical area. Until all of the United States realizes what happened, and the senators and the congressmen, then they ask the Justice Department, and Justice Department will answer like they did in the ITT, we didn't do anything wrong. They have one pat answer, they have their cover story, but first people have to ask them what they think about this, and the people in this country are totally uninformed. So it's a vicious circle. What he went on to say was that he went to the Canadian government with introductions. He had the false name, and Canada was told to hire him, and the Justice Department gave him also a minister's permit. You see, when you go to Canada, you have to have an excuse for being employed because they're having a shortage of jobs and unemployment. So you have to guarantee that you can support yourself if you go in. They don't just let an American cross the border and take a job a Canadian has. But their excuse for doing this, that Gervais's life might be in danger if he stayed in the United States if he was found. So they'll give asylum or jobs if they protect somebody. So they gave him a minister's permit. And this again goes into the whole framework of churches, because I have 200 or 300 typewritten pages of ministers that are intelligence agents, that are spies and intelligence agencies, that it's a conduit of funds through various church groups. And all the people working on political assassinations know how the conduit of funds runs through the church groups. Remember the show we did about Albert Osborne, the missionary in Mexico City, who ran a school for assassins that go all over the world, that kill political people all over the world, and they're all dressed as missionaries, and they're funded through church groups as a front. So he was given a minister's permit.
That refers to a man of the cloth and not necessarily a permit from the Prime Minister or something?
Well, the Prime Minister of Canada doesn't have anything to do with it. There are intelligence agencies in the Canadian government that, like there are here, and we exchange spies and protection. So our country says he's a minister, and they let him preach, in quotes, at General Motors for $18,000 a year. See, they have to manipulate the Canadian books, too, so that the Canadian people don't feel that too many Americans are getting in illegal and getting jobs. So they have to manipulate everything up there, what the reason for his getting in. So he gets a minister's permit using the cloth, again, the church, which the church trip and the justice thing are so confused in our society, the role that they're playing. And he lives up in Canada, and then his child is 6 years old and ready to go to school. Then they have to issue a fake birth certificate. Now, you can see how I cross-file this. When you have James Ray up in Canada, within a mile of where he lives, he has birth certificates and passports from 3 people that live in the area that he does, and Mr. Galden and Mr. Bridgman and Mr. Sneed. And he's using all these aliases, or he gets out of the Missouri jail. Remember last week we said with a Social Security card by the name of Rain, so he can start a job as soon as he's sprung out of jail. Issuing the aliases is nothing new to me. To see it in the news and to see so many of the things I talk about exemplified in one article that just happened this week is maybe better to explain on the air, because people who have followed these shows can see that I've made charges that these things are happening. And one of the interesting things is that Pershing Gervais has not only made the charges, but he's naming a lot of people, and that's his protection, because they don't want to take the rap. This is the first time that a lot of charges have been made where he's actually mentioning the people. So he said he went to Vancouver, the General Motors office, and that he was employed there. Now, Gervais had filled out a 107-page affidavit against Jim Garrison, and he has said that he was advised by the Justice Department after he did it to hide out. Now Gervais is surfacing, and he says it comes down to this. I've been working at a fake job in Canada since January. I've been living there since last July. That's when the charges against Garrison came down. And it was all because of connivance between the Justice Department, the Canadian government, and General Motors. Now, this article that I'm reading has no wire service on it. This comes straight from the New Orleans paper. So the ABUP Reuters hasn't picked it up. He says, I'm only here with a fake job, a fake name, receiving money, you see, for services I didn't do because of the connivance of our Justice Department and Canada and General Motors. And then he said, I'm heading back to New Orleans, and I'm taking my time about it. Now, that was May 25th that he was heading back to New Orleans. On May 26th, the New Orleans paper had another article, again, not Associated Press, United Press, that there's a contract to kill Pershing Gervais in New Orleans for saying what he did. Now, the Justice Department killed David Ferry when Lee Harvey Oswald was dead and Jack Ruby was dead, and Jim Garrison was conducting this trial. The most important witness in the New Orleans area that he needed was David Ferry, and David Ferry was killed just as soon as Garrison mentioned his name. The name Ferry wasn't new to Garrison. He was with the FBI telling them about David Ferry the night that John Kennedy was killed, and he was waiting at David Ferry's place to arrest him as being suspicious of having wanted to kill Kennedy for the role that he took with the anti-Castro Cubans in the area and his verbal attacks on wanting Kennedy killed. And he had a lot of other reasons to suspect David Ferry, but the FBI let David Ferry off and didn't even mention his name in the Warren report, and of course he wasn't called as a witness. So when Patrick Gray III talks about these funny assassins that are completely withdrawn and don't react as any of us do, David Ferry may have been a withdrawn person, but the FBI could have drawn him out to come before the Warren Commission to say where he was the night of the assassination and the day of the assassination of John Kennedy. So you have Pershing Gervais coming back to New Orleans. It is a contract now to kill him. He has a lot of courage. He's given up this dirty little game. And what he said, this is very interesting, he said that he was hired at General Motors, and they just said, he met the president of General Motors, who for some reason wanted to see him, and they just gave him a job and said, go to work, and he didn't do anything at General Motors at all. He didn't do any part as a salesman or serve any purpose. His $18,000 a year was to be just a payoff. Well, when Jim Garrison first surfaced years ago and charged Clay Shaw with conspiracy, I picked up the telephone from Carmel Valley and called the district attorney's office at New Orleans and said, go to Riley Coffee Company in New Orleans, because based upon my research, that is a CIA operation that they hire people who serve no purpose there, and it's a conduit of funds for agents. Because when Lee Harvey Oswald worked there, the man who employed him was asked before the Warren Commission, what did Oswald do? And he said, well, we gave him an oil can, and told him to go from the top all the way down to the bottom, from the sixth floor to the bottom. Well, Lee Harvey Oswald, who was trained in electronic work and radio work and microdotting and photographic techniques and all the complicated skills, Russian languages, all the skills that he had as an agent would serve no purpose just taking an oil can and going from the sixth floor down to the first, any more than just moving boxes at a depository, you know. So I knew that it was then the landlady, there was a landlady in New Orleans who was also called as a witness, and the Warren Commission said to her, tell us about Lee Harvey Oswald and the job he had and when did he go to work. And she said, well, I don't think he worked in the daytime because he was home all day at night. You know, he had a small baby and he'd sit out on the porch with his wife, and he was home during the day, but at nighttime people came and he went out at night. So then I knew that he was receiving a paycheck from Riley Coffee, but he wasn't going to work in the daytime because she said he was home all day. So I knew the funds were for services rendered at the time that he wasn't actually working. So you have the same pattern in General Motors in Canada, and it's a thing which I picked up reading the testimony of the witnesses. It turns out to be a habit. Don't you have a news bulletin here?
Well, it's a news item that sort of confirms that, and it's from, again, not one of the major wire services, but from a news service. It's an alternative news service in San Francisco called Zodiac News Service. It came out this past Wednesday, and I'll just read through it, and it substantiates some of what Mae has been saying. The U.S. Department of Justice admitted this week that it has made a practice of asking major American corporations to hire former Justice Department informers and spies so that they can be moved to out-of-the-way and inconspicuous places after completing their spy work. A department spokesman told Zodiac News that, and we quote, at least a dozen, but fewer than 100 informers, unquote, had been hired as a public service by numerous corporations after the informers had completed their assigned tasks with the Justice Department. The practice of large companies hiring ex-informers surfaced last week during a Canadian television interview with Pershing Gervais. Gervais stated that he had been hired by the Justice Department last year to entrap New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, as we've been talking about. And it turns out that Gervais had been employed for the past 3 months by the General Motors Company in Vancouver, Canada, at an annual salary of $18,000. General Motors reports that it hired Gervais, quote, at the request of the Justice Department, unquote, after the department informed GM that it wanted to locate Gervais at, quote, an out-of-the-way location, unquote. The Justice Department acknowledged that the practice of asking corporations to hire ex-informers was very common and very successful. That, again, a quote. Said the Justice spokesman, we've seen to it that quite a few informers have been hired, although we can't give you a specific figure. When asked if IT&T had ever stepped forward to offer employment, the spokesman said he would not name any of the corporations involved, but he added they do it simply as a public service. And that is from Zodiac News.
Well, this confirms a lot of the research that I've done reading the witness testimony before the Warren Commission. There were 552 witnesses, and I noticed that certain people would be called in to give testimony, and they had a set occupation, and they came from a certain city, like Wellesley Frazier, the man who went in the book depository that took Oswald there the morning of the assassination. He lived across the street from where Lee Harvey Oswald's wife was living with Mrs. Ruth Payne. He moved into town in the fall of '63. He went to the depository and worked there maybe 2 months. And by the time the Warren Commission called him as a witness, he was in another city in another job. And I began to cross-file about 50, 60 people, and I made my own cross-filing classification called migratory birds, where people changed occupations, and all of a sudden a shoe salesman ends up at Lockheed Aircraft, or a gasoline station attendant is with the Dallas Police Force. And by reconstructing where these people came from and where they went, I realized that there was an entire military type of operation of people moving into town, being in strategic positions, and then leaving. By the time they were called as witnesses, they were on whole new occupations.
Yeah, we'll get back with more on Dialogue Conspiracy after we identify the station. This is KLRB FM, Carmel, stereo 24 hours a day. So getting back to this term that you've made up, migratory birds,
yes,
to describe these people that are placed in corporations after they've done their task for the government?
That's right. Once they plant their evidence or they're involved in the political murders and they're used as witnesses, or like the Justice Department says, they say they use them as spies or ex-informers. These are people that provide information on alleged assassins that isn't true, and they know their life will be in danger. They sort of frame them in court, and the government places them into jobs and offers them positions in defense industries and ammunition factories, particularly in the Southwest. And I discovered this pattern as I was reading the witness testimony and made this cross-filing system.
So the Zodiac News story sort of fits right in
exactly
with what you've been talking about.
To summarize, before I want to go back to the shooting of Wallace, but just to summarize the news stories from the New Orleans State Item and what Pershing Gervais is saying in the Zodiac News is that I have filing systems on political assassinations, manila envelopes, where I separate various subject matters, a single article. I will put it into various subject matters like mathematical columns I've explained before, because just to put the article in one place doesn't describe what's happening. So I take the information about Pershing Gervais being hired by the Justice Department and I put it under Justice Department planting evidence against somebody, because you see, I'm building a case like this Seattle case that we talked about, that they are the criminals. So in every instance where they plant evidence against people to make somebody look guilty who's really innocent, they are actually the criminals, the conspirators. Then I filed under the Justice Department effecting trials, because the legal system not only they're trying to get Garrison into court and get him to jail in these heavy sentences, and they are interfering with the legal processes. They are making him look guilty. And in many cases, there's very, very people who are also innocent, and the Justice Department mishandles evidence that they themselves didn't plant, but they hinder the truth coming out. So there's two distinctions. In this case, they're actually involved in the conspiracy. And the second place, they are affecting the legal system. And then I cross-file this under news media and news control until I see this article in the New York Times, and I take 8 papers a day. The underground press will pick it up, and I'm waiting to see the major news service, Reuters, Associated Press, United Press, if they don't carry it. And these are heavy accusations that come from Canada, that come from Pershing Gervais. The Canadian government has admitted that the head of the intelligence there, employment, W.L. Higgin, has admitted that they were involved in this, and they have not denied their role, neither has General Motors up there. So this isn't just blowing in the wind. And if there's such news control in this country that people don't know about it, I put that under news control so that you have instances of how many times something really important about political assassinations comes across that you are not told about. I have many things that I get from all the newspapers that I take that do not come over all the papers that you're not told about, but my specialty is things relating to political assassination. And then I cross-file this under documents forged, like birth certificates, passports, and because this is done by our Justice Department, not to protect people's lives, but to lock innocent people in jail and provide documents to save the guilty, let them run away and be free. The people that plant the evidence are freed by forged documents issued by our Justice Department. Then you get into alias, the use of aliases. They also provide those. They provide covers. See, the Justice Department should be rounding up criminals. They shouldn't be the criminal. And they do everything to hide their traces. So they produce documents. They stop the news from being told. They give aliases. And then I have the thing about jobs where conspirators go. This goes into migratory birds. And jobs where I have indication that men are on salaries that for things that they're not earning. Like Lee Harvey Oswald and James Ray and Sirhan, where they're getting money. Or Bremer, you'll find that he quit his job in Milwaukee in January, but he's been moving around and spending a lot of money. Then I also have it under people who get off from being prosecuted. Nobody here is going to be called in or prosecuted. Now, the chain of command goes to 3 people in the Justice Department that Pershing Gervais has named. It will never get up to John Mitchell being arrested for this conspiracy. He should be, but he'll get off. And why should he get off? And then I have another thing called change of command, how you lose your traces, and this involves all the other processes and is something like migratory bird, but how in a political assassination you can't start right off the bat and say Richard Nixon did it or Lyndon Johnson did it. There's a long chain of command, just like Tony Boyle, the mine workers being pulled in now. The money that is passed for killing, when you hire somebody to kill or plant evidence, maybe changes hands 20 times. It's very hard to find the original culprit. And it's not my job, when I say there's political conspiracies, to name every single person in the chain of command. But I think some of them should be called in. And then I have a thing called witnesses to call. And these are members of the Justice Department that have been named. And who does the forging of documents? What department? Hands out the aliases. And then it goes into government and clandestine finances. How much of the taxpayers' money is spent paying people for jobs? I'm sure that the Canadian General Motors is given money from our Justice Department, $18,000, just to pay Gervais to not do anything. This is just to get Jim Garrison. How much of your taxpayers' money? If the Justice Department told the Zodiac News they have 100 such people, I can mention 100 people that were involved in the John Kennedy murder that were financed and moved around. They're lying about that. They have hundreds. And then I have CIA cooperation in other countries, how the intelligence agencies help us frame Jim Garrison, take these people in. They know what role Gervais had and how we cooperate with other countries in doing intelligence work. That instead of looking for justice, they help us hide the guilty and the people that are lying and planting the evidence, and they go along with us and cooperate. Well, that covers the Jim Garrison case in New Orleans pretty well to date, and I think the federal government should be prosecuted, the Justice Department, for all the charges I make about them every week, and more evidence is coming through if we analyze it together just slowly and on the air.
Before we go to Wallace, let's use this transition as a chance to comment on the postcards that we asked for last week. Did get quite a few.
Yeah.
And we thank the people who responded, and you will note at the end of the program that we will remind you of the address to write if you have any questions that you'd like answered on the next program. If possible, they will be answered, or if you have any comments. And we encourage the people who heard the request last week to send a postcard, just simply stating that you're a listener and that you followed the program and you want it to continue. It helps to show that to station management to make sure the program stays on. So if you're listening now and you find yourself, you don't have to agree, but if you find yourself intellectually challenged, and if you would like to indicate that you are a listener, just send a card. A postcard is all it will take, actually, to Dialogue Conspiracy, care of KLRB, Box 3904 in Carmel. That's all there is to it. Let's go to Wallace.
Okay, just before we went on the air, somebody called the station and was talking to you, Phil, and asked a question about how I tied Wallace into the political conspiracy, and I'll answer that in, like you said, 1,000 words or less. We've done 2 shows, and we're going to go on some more details of the Bramer thing since we met last week. We have done 2 shows on Wallace, and it's hard to go back. It's a continual process, and we hope everybody who listens keeps listening and follows it up. But the question was asked on the telephone, ask Mae how she connects the Governor Wallace shooting to the general conspiracy. Was that the question you were asked? So my answer...
Right, well, the person had wondered...
Yeah, so I had just finished completing this week an article for the Conspiracy newsletter that's coming out, and we'll have to give you that address before we go off, on tying together the Governor Wallace shooting to the past political assassinations. And the way I see it is that the shooting of Governor Wallace is to set the stage for Nixon's assassination. This is based on many books and articles of research, and I can't go into all the references now.
Why do you need to set the stage for his assassination, his alleged assassination?
Why do you have to set the stage? Well, because if you just shoot Nixon and you say, well, you're going to take Agnew, here's your president, people may get pretty mad. They may think, oh, Agnew manipulated this or staged it. You see, Agnew's being very low-key now. He's just staying in the background. John Connolly's staying in the background, and everything's very quiet in their camp. They're very low-key. And Reagan loves Nixon, and Agnew loves Nixon, and everybody's, having a love affair with Nixon, and they're very quiet. But the important thing is that the Secret Service has come out now, and I think they placed Brammer there and photographed him in these crowds in Canada so they could say, see, no matter how much surveillance we have or data banks, there's no way to find an assassin. Then you have Patrick Gray coming out today, or yesterday rather, and saying there's no way to detect an assassin. So you have the Secret Service, the FBI, have no responsibility. If Richard Nixon is killed, they have no responsibility. Then you go into the thing of Louis Tackwood's charges in the LA Police Department that they were planning through Squad 19, criminal conspiracy section, to kill Richard Nixon. In order, they were going to plant bombs first and have the radicals rounded up. This is what we talk about, your provocateurs in San Diego. And that the same thing that Hitler did with the Reichstag fire when he came into power, they were to round up all the radicals and have an emergency state because of the chaos or the violence in this country of certain people being killed in San Diego. And in lieu of this temporary police state or emergency power, then Richard Nixon would be killed. And they would say, well, now we absolutely need the power. You see, if the emergency state is set, wherever the convention is, by increased violence or killing innocent members of Congress and government, at a convention, and if you round up all the radicals and have planted these bombs, you have all the machinery ready to create a total police state. And Louis Tackwood said that this police state goes all the way from the top down. This isn't just in the LA Police Department. It involves the FBI and officials from the top down. And that he stopped being a provocateur for the police department just as Pershing Gervais surfaced, because the whole thing was repugnant to him, and he knew that then it would be a police state. So you have the Tackwood charges. Then who do you have sitting one bullet away from Richard Nixon? You have Spiro Agnew. Now, it was very important to the same people that overthrew Greece, the Pappas Foundation, the Litton Industries, as a conduit of funds, that Agnew be selected as the vice president. Why would they want him as their vice president unless they realized his potential as a president? So the same people that overthrew a conservative government in Greece who had the chance of becoming more liberal 3 months later and put in a fascist military dictatorship had a particular reason for insisting that Agnew be the vice president. And I don't think he sat there all these 4 years just to watch some animals fornicate in Nairobi. I think he's there for Kenya. I think he's there for some other purpose. And I don't like the people that move in and out with Agnew. I don't like his stand. He's come down against the media, youth. He's showing you where his head is at, and he's just one bullet away from what would take place. And I don't feel, the reason I feel that it would be Nixon that is killed because there's so much effort to put Agnew where he is in this strategic position. Now, the populist vote could go, say, to Ted Kennedy or McGovern, and these are the people that seem to be taking the tide. Well, in Greece, you had Papandreou, who's been compared to John Kennedy. When John Kennedy won the election by this fluke and could possibly win in 1964, he had gone too far. He had to be killed. Knowing who killed John Kennedy and working 9 years on that and working at the same time on the background of Agnew and put him into place and knowing that these murders happened, then you see the Computer and Automation has an article that McGovern or Ted Kennedy would be killed based upon computer information on the past political assassinations and conspiracies. Well, if elections are coming up and you don't want another John Kennedy and you killed Robert Kennedy and you don't want Ted or McGovern, if you keep killing them on the line, people may even say, okay, we'll take Hubert. But that isn't good enough this time around. You see, it would be much better by my analyzing the various books and resources and material I have to say that they'll create a lot of incidences of violence preceding the next elections, and then Richard Nixon will be killed because now we have the FBI and the Secret Service saying, what can we do? And then the provisions for taking over the government after Richard Nixon's killed are all set because Roy Ash of Litton Industry has designed our new cabinet that goes into effect in 1972 that takes away all departments that take care of the interests of the people. That's what fascism is. You know, then you have war.
What is this reference to Roy Ash?
Well, Roy Ash of Litton Industries was very heavy into being a conduit of funds that overthrew Greece. And he is the man who has designed our new cabinet, who selected John Connolly for Secretary of Treasury. He works in government he works in Greece with the people that overthrew it. He is a very important person in terms of designing our ecology program, our cabinet.
What position does he have with the government?
Well, he came up from practically nothing to be one of the wealthiest defense contractors in the past 20 years. The United States government is swinging all his efforts into the Navy department of it, and Navy ships. Of course, Navy intelligence is the conduit of funds for all the political assassinations and the importation of Nazis to this country from Nazi Germany. Roy Ash has, I have a whole file if you want to do one whole show on Roy Ash and Litton Industries and their role in affecting the framework of our government on the books. You see, when a new ruling comes in about a jury system where you don't need a majority and the justices argue that there's nothing there that says minorities have to be recognized, there's nothing in the Constitution. That's the way it read last week. The new laws of repression are coming down very quickly, and one specific comment of a justice of the Supreme Court, it says minorities can observe. There's nothing that says they have to vote. You can have 3 blacks on a jury now, and you can still send a guy off for life. It doesn't mean that they necessarily have the right to vote. They have the right to observe. That's the reading of the Supreme Court. You see, so the new Constitution that was designed in 1970 has provisions for one man to be president for 9 years and not have re-elections. He's accountable to nobody.
What new Constitution?
Well, there's a framework of a new Constitution designed, signed by the government to have agents. People studied it and wrote it up. It was printed in the New York Times in 1970. I have a file on that, on the new Constitution.
New Constitution?
Yes. And
this was printed in the New York Times?
Oh, but 2 full pages.
Provisional Constitution?
Remind me, and I'll bring it next week. The new Constitution will do away entirely with the Senate. There's going to be, they will be appointed by former vice presidents and persons appointed by the president, public officials. The new Constitution that has been drawn. Now, they don't say this will be in effect in 1972, but I was doing some research this week and reading, again, parts of the rise and fall of the Third Reich. And when Hitler took his oath in January 30th, 1933, he promised the cabinet they would remain. He promised them they'd have elections. 5 days after he took his oath, everything changed. So that all the provisions, what you have to say to yourself is these provisions are there. Who wrote this new Constitution, even if we don't use it? Who is doing away with the Senate? Who's doing away with the Supreme Court? Who is having a president that is 9 years and that counts to nobody? Then part of the Constitution does away with the Bill of Rights. You can no longer have the right to bear arms, and you can go into homes without seizures. You can do that practically now. But it does away with the whole list of Bill of Rights. They're immediately eliminated. Now, you want to know who in America designed that?
Who designed it and for what purpose?
That's right. It's all there, you see. So I think...
Well, but when the story came out, who was credited with
they
this
said
thing?
They blamed Hutchins and the Institute down in Santa Barbara for doing the research. Prague.
How did the New York Times get it?
Chief Justice. Oh, the government assigned people to study a new Constitution. And the Constitution that came out in 1970 was identical to the way that Greece is run. And because Spiro Agnew is put into office by Tom Pappas and the CIA foundations and Esso Oil in Greece, a man that lives in Greece permanently comes over here and tells Richard Nixon, if you want the nomination, you have to take Agnew. Well, you have Agnew sitting one bullet away from a total presidency, and you have this Constitution all set up that is working in Greece now, where the Senate is appointed and there's no more elections. They decide who will run for office. And next week, if there isn't any great assassination news, no person killed in between now and then, maybe I should bring it in and read it.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. I think people would like to read the new Constitution. That may be their framework of their government sometime in the future.
Is that a 1,000-word answer on why I think that Wallace shooting was setting the stage?
It was a little more than 1,000 words, but we'll overlook that.
It's hard for me, when somebody asks me a question, to condense it to one sentence, because the answer I get is, that's not true, or the answer, you got this particular person says Mae's paranoid. Well, my answer to people who call me paranoid is, if they read the same things that I do and see something different, that is interesting. But if they haven't read the material that I've accumulated, which comes through their news media, and they haven't seen it, how do they have a basis to decide that there isn't more to worry about than they're worrying? I think the response of people today is a mental sickness that borders on being autistic, that people don't even speak up. They're mentally sick in a way because their voices are not heard, and they're responding in a way that's not appropriate to what's really happening.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes left, so
okay, we're going to go back.
Fly through this.
Well, I made a lot of notes on Bremer. Our Monterey Herald, I'll take an article that was in the Monterey Herald because people can look this up as a reference. It was May 29th, last Monday, called Bremer Left an Erratic Trail Months Before the Shooting. We might say that Wallace was shot on May the 15th, and we did a show that Saturday on the 20th. And I predicted that was going to be a conspiracy based upon the news just from Monday to Saturday, and why I thought that Bremer would be tied in with intelligence agencies. And it had a lot to do with the cover story. No conspiracy, that they said right away, loner, misfit, that they used for Oswald, Ray, and Sirhan, which were not the right adjectives. And he had no accomplices, which was impossible to find out within 5 days. The Justice Department didn't even know where he had been. And they said that one day after Wallace was shot, or the same day. And then they said he was influenced by Sirhan and Oswald. And I knew that was a cover story. It's funny, the article this week said that on May the 5th, he was dashing around from different cities in Michigan, Milwaukee, but he goes into the library in Milwaukee and checks out 2 books on Sirhan. Now, from May the 5th until May 16th, if you read where he was from Milwaukee to Cadillac, Michigan, to Maryland, and back to Kalamazoo, Michigan, then back to Maryland, he didn't even have time to read those 2 books. So that was a cover story. Connecting, they're trying to show that, see, the actual facts are now that he made a lot of trips, 900 miles in one day, which is practically impossible. And this goes in again, the doubles. There were 2 Oswalds that looked alike. There were 2 Rays. There were 2 Sirhans. And the FBI and the news departments are trying to put together where Bremer was. And I think he had a double like there were 2 Lee Harvey Oswalds. They were floating around the Dallas area and New Orleans and Mexico. And now you have Bremer, which is an impossible situation with car licenses in one place. And don't forget, the first suspect that was picked up in Maryland was caught switching license plates from Georgia to Maryland. So, they're trying to figure out how he could get all these places, But the point I want to make is that it was only May the 5th that he checked out these books on Sirhan. And then he did hundreds of miles of traveling from May the 5th to May 15th. So the cover story that he was influenced, like all the other assassins, that you're going to lump Oswald, Sirhan, Ray, and Bremer into one package is so contrived. It's an outright lie. And I hope someday will begin to insult your intelligence. So anyway, this article, we'll go into this article of May 29th, because what I'm going to talk about, we don't have much time, I'm going to talk about the paths that he took. And on the other side of the paper, I outlined the things that the FBI couldn't figure out. So it's 2 weeks since the shooting of Wallace, and the FBI is admitting that there's puzzling aspects to this Milwaukee shooting. And it said that major portions of Bremer's time, major portions, are accounted for from April the 4th to May 15th. Some of them are left out, but they don't have anything for him from January 21st when he left his job until April. Now, I'm going to read the discrepancies that the news is talking about after 2 weeks after the shooting and asking how Mr. Patrick Gray III of the Justice Department said it was no conspiracy, how the head of the Treasury Department, the chief of police, said he was alone, that he had no accomplices. Remember, those articles that we saved came out immediately after the shooting. Now they're admitting there's a big gap from April 20th to 27th. By telling you, on the one hand, that he was found with only $2 means he's down to his last nickel, he's got this beaten-up car, and he's just a poor derelict. But if he stayed at the Waldorf Astoria 3 days, he could be at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles from April to 27th. The point is, as long as they don't know where he was, how can they say that he didn't receive money for things or account for how much money he had? They've already come out with what the balance was in his savings account. But why doesn't the government, if they don't know where he was, they don't know what he spent. So they're going to run over. This is what they did with Lee Harvey Oswald. They took all the money that they knew he earned, or unemployment checks, from the time he came home to the Soviet Union till the time that John Kennedy was killed. But under finances, I began reading the Warren Commission hearings and exhibits and found out he was spending over and over what they accounted for on a lot of little things that they didn't even put in. And then what do you do with that figure, you see? So now they have a gap of April the 20th to 27th, and they were told that he was also in Pennsylvania. Now, once again, the FBI refuses to comment on all these investigations. Patrick Gray III, the new head of the FBI, who came in just preceding this Wallace shooting, stopped the investigations in Los Angeles of Salazar and other people, so why would he continue the investigations into this? He's being very quiet. The FBI isn't saying anything. There were inquiries into Pittsburgh, but the agency has not pinned down all of Bremer's travels. This is what they said. They have not yet pinned down. They've told you he has no accomplice. They told you he lived within his means, but they don't know where he was. And they don't know who he was with. But they tell you it was no conspiracy. Now, they said, there was a question, did he have his car in New York City? He was at the Waldorf Astoria at a certain date, April the 9th. He stayed there 2 nights. And then he traveled 932 miles to be on a certain boat at 8:15 in the evening. But was there any proof after he took his car from Birmingham, New York, was there any proof that he actually had his car in New York City? So they're checking out his transportation by airplanes, which is, again, another trip or another name or aliases. You see, now the FBI says he traveled mostly by car. And this is the way I like to do my research and share it with you, and hope that when you read the papers, you learn something from this 1-hour show. The FBI says he traveled mostly by car. That means they already know he used some other means of transportation, and they're not telling you, because he wasn't walking 300 miles or 600 miles, you see, and coming to a city, staying there 10 minutes, and then returning back in another direction. If he took mostly by car, he only has to take an airplane once or twice. Who was he with? Why aren't they telling you the other means of transportation? If the FBI says he traveled by car, that's it, period. But they're telling you there was other transportation because he traveled mostly by car. They're revealing that. Then they say it is not known why Bremer left home so quickly. One theory was that he needed fresh supplies of money. Well, that's only a theory. How do they know he left quickly? they have him going to a lot of different places, so he had to move quickly. Now, on April the 5th or 6th, it is acknowledged that he was seen with associates. But they have not pointed out any associates. They have not denied associates at the Waldorf Hotel, the Sheraton Hotel. You see, this is what they did with the investigation of Jack Ruby. The Warren Commission said there was no conspiracy. And a month before they went to press, one of the attorneys writes and says, we can't say there was no conspiracy because Ruby's still dickering for his fate, meaning he's still alive. So we'll say, as far as we have gone, there is no evidence of a conspiracy. So the question is, how far do they really know? That we know that he was seen on a ferry boat with these other people. But the Waldorf has not said he was not with somebody, and neither has the Sheraton Hotel in Maryland said he was not with somebody. They just said he stayed there. But they did not say he was not with them. And from April the 20th to 27th, and from January the 1st to April 20th, they have no knowledge of him at all. Now, the Monterey Herald, I think it would be good for you people who do listen to the show to go to the library and Xerox, fold that page and copy it, May 29th, on Bramer's trails, because we'll compare them on another show to James Ray's travels and how he moved around into many cities, was seen with associates. Time doesn't allow on the program to go through every day of where he was. They begin with May 8th at the Waldorf Astoria, and then they take him to New York City, and the Walls headquarters, they have in April, the Walls headquarters in Milwaukee, and then back to New York, and then to Lansing, Michigan, and then they have him at the Lord Elgin Hotel in Ottawa, Canada, where he's photographed in the crowd with Richard Nixon. They have him back in Maryland in the Sheraton hotels, and then bring him to New York, and then there's a gap where they don't know where he stayed, and some woman saw him in Milwaukee, April 19th, and then the 20th, 27th, there's no record of his travels. Then he was back in Milwaukee, and then April 28th, and then Ludington, Michigan, and then checked out his books back in Milwaukee, and back to Lansing, Michigan. These are long ferry boat rides. He was seen in Cadillac, Michigan at a rally in May the 10th. The 11th, Landover, Michigan, then the 12th, he was in Kalamazoo, and then back to Maryland. And he didn't have time to read those books about Sirhan and Ray, as I say. But I feel, as I outlined this article on his trail, that what you're getting here is a summation of what I've said on the last 2 weeks shows, that the real Bremer is far from being told. The story is far from being told. He was with people. He had access to fancy hotels. He purposely was losing his traces. He was moving around in an erratic way, but it wasn't purposeless. It achieved what it wanted by shooting Wallace, possibly wiping out competition for the anti-busing votes for Nixon, setting the stage. I say again, the shooting of Wallace was to set the stage, and the fact that if somebody killed any candidate before our election in 72, there's no guarantee that he would be protected. It's been proven now by the camera. So, Phil, I don't have time to go over all of the comparisons I've been working out since the first Wallace shooting, comparisons between Bremer and the other alleged assassins. But we don't have time to go through those now.
Right, we're out of time.